So let's get started. Hello and welcome to our viewers in the United States and Europe. I'm Katja Donovan, Executive Director at 1014, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the third event in our new virtual series, which is held in cooperation with the American Council on Germany. The series is called Hot Topics, Cold Realities. And in each episode, we plan to explore the issues that are being debated in Germany and in the United States. We want to unpack today's hot topics with German and American experts and put them under the microscope to parse out the cold realities we're finding ourselves in.
And my name is Steve Sokol. I'm the president of the American Council on Germany, and we are delighted to be partnering with 1014 once again and very much look forward to today's episode, but also to continuing the series. So today, we thought that it would be a good time to talk about the so-called green energy transition. And while we saw the green movement gain significant momentum during the previous administrations in both the United States and Germany, but also across Europe, it now seems to have taken the back seat over concerns around energy sources overall, the economy, and security issues. Having said that, I think that the timing for our conversation today could hardly be better because it comes on the heels of the 16th Petersburg Climate Dialogue, which just took place in Berlin earlier this week. Of course, discussions at that climate dialogue focused mostly on preparations for the UN Climate Change Conference, or COP30, which will take place in Brazil later this year. And it's worth noting that the United States was not present at the Petersburg Klimadialog. Both of our speakers are based in Europe, but both of them have a broader perspective. And today we're joined by Cameron Abadi. He's deputy editor at Foreign Policy and co-host of Foreign Policy's Ones and Twos podcast. He just finished recording the latest episode. He's also the author of a book called Climate Radicals: Why Our Environmental Politics Isn't Working, in which he profiles the actions of the German activist group Letzte Generation. And I'm sure we'll pick up on that later in our conversation. Cameron, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for organizing this.
And also with us is Dr. Kira Vinke. She's the head of the Center for Climate and Foreign Policy at the German Council on Foreign Relations, based in Berlin. And Kira is an expert particularly on climate impacts and human development. She's also a frequent commentator in the German and international media. Kira, herzlich willkommen. It's always great to see you.
Thank you.
So before we get started, let me just remind everybody that both 1014 and the American Council on Germany are nonpartisan organizations. And so the views expressed in this conversation are those of our two experts. If you'd like to ask a question during today's event, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will do our best to fold those questions into the conversation.
All right, so let's get started. And I would like to open the conversation with the question of whether you actually agree with our statement that the green transition is taking a backseat, both in the United States and in Europe. And just Steve mentioned the Petersburg Climate Dialogue. What's happening to the 1.5 degree goal? Is that still realistic in today's world, or do we need to readjust this limit for global warming above pre-industrial levels that was established in the 2015 Paris Agreement? What are the contours of German and European climate policies? So maybe, Kira, we start with you and just take a look at the situation in Germany first. So German Parliament just approved a massive spending package for defense and infrastructure, but with 100 billion euros of that infrastructure fund dedicated to climate projects, something that the Green Party managed to negotiate in order to get it passed through Parliament. So could you shed light on the priorities in Germany right now? So what's the new government about?
Yes, so thank you so much for this question. I mean, I think broadly speaking, the energy transition towards renewables is unstoppable. And this also goes for, I believe, Germany and the US. But of course, the question with regards to the temperature limits is how fast we can roll out renewables and how quickly we can phase out the damaging things, fossil fuels, in particular oil, coal, and gas. And this is, of course, a challenge in all of our societies who have been a long time dependent on these fossil resources. So what we are seeing in Germany right now in the coalition negotiations, and these documents have been widely leaked, so I'm not spilling any intel on this, is that there is broad consensus to fight for the Paris Agreement, to adhere to the net zero target that Germany has for 2045. But there's also still some areas of disagreement and a stronger focus on the German economy. Germany has had a lagging economy for many reasons, in particular also the energy crisis that resulted from the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. And so there is a stronger focus on sort of competitiveness. We see this also at the EU level with the new distribution of the climate portfolio in the Commission. And we see this also in the language of the coalition treaty drafts, which have been leaked, as I mentioned. So we see here a focus on many different technologies, also some disagreement between CDU and the SPD on issues such as the use of the heating power law, if this should be completely revamped or there should be like just a sort of novelty to it. There is differences in sectors such as how much gas backup do we need for our energy system in the future. And there's also disagreement on how much money should be going towards research, for example, in the areas such as nuclear fusion, and also for what parts we use, for example, CCS and CCU technologies, so these carbon capture and storage questions, technologies that are not yet fully economical or efficient, but that may become more relevant in the future, especially for hard-to-abate sectors, but some want to use this and apply this more broadly. So these are areas where there is some difference. However, I do not see a complete breaking or turn away from the pathway that Germany has set out with its energy transition, which I think is very important. We need to stay the course here. Germany and Europe needs to stay the course on both the international commitments, but also on the way they have outlined their national energy transition.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Kira. And yeah, so it's interesting. It's so interesting. You say the Energiewende is unstoppable. So the transition to green energy is unstoppable. And I'm wondering, Cameron, when it comes to the United States, what your take on that position is. Do you agree with that? And of course, we have a new administration in the United States, and we see a lot of undoing of President Biden's signature climate legislation. We've seen a flurry of executive orders, for example, that ease regulations on oil and gas production and restrictions on drilling in Alaska and ban new leases for offshore wind projects. I mean, we could go on and list a few more. And the Environmental Protection Agency has announced a rollback of 31 environmental regulations, to cut back on bureaucracy. So what is happening in the United States? Would you agree with Kira that the transition to green energy is unstoppable despite, what we're seeing here in the United States?
Broadly speaking, I would agree with that assessment because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think that assessment is based on general market mechanisms that are in place that are producing this transition. There's a demand for clean energy. The costs of clean energy are dropping, and that produces by economic mechanisms shifts that produce this transition. That we all politically claim to desire. The question, as Kira also said, though, has always been how quickly is this transition happening? And I think that bears then on your question, Katja, about the 1.5 degree target that is set out in law in the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think that's been clear for a while, that target is not going to be met. In fact, that's not only true in a global sense, but there's no single country, including no single democracy, that has managed to be on a path to meeting the commitments consistent with that 1.5 degree limit. And so, that's a general point, I think, about the politics involved, about the speed of this transition, and what role politics is playing in accelerating a transition that I think is happening regardless. And certainly right now in the United States, you're seeing an enormous political shift. And when I wrote the book that Steve mentioned at the very outset, the situation was very different. And in a sense, the context has shifted in that it was Germany that I think was very pessimistic about being able to make the political commitments necessary to meet its goals, while the United States offered a kind of political model under Biden that made it seem like that seemed to show a path forward to accelerating this transition. Now it's to some extent Germany taking up the Biden political model in ways that perhaps we can discuss, but in the United States, the Trump administration coming in and as you said, Katja, really aggressively reversing the political progress that was made. I mean, and it's important to say here that it's quite clearly ideologically motivated. And I think one aspect that has always been true in the United States, that there is no consensus on the goal of there is no political consensus on the goal of stopping climate change that is now really coming to bear. And so the Trump administration is in many ways opposed not only to prioritizing climate policy, but opposed to climate policy in total. And so that's really what's marking this reversal and the aggressiveness of this reversal. It's not only a shift in priorities; it's an acceleration in the opposite direction.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would like to pick up on one thing, Kira, that you also mentioned, and that is carbon capture and storage. You mentioned that with respect to the political agreement, the coalition agreement between the two leading parties. So far, I always had the sense that maybe in the United States, there was a focus on solving the climate problems through new technologies, such as carbon capture, whereas in Europe, the focus was more on shifting to sustainable solutions, such as renewable energy, reforestation, and such. So now, is that maybe changing? And Cameron said, maybe Europe now takes on the Biden model. So is that part of the Biden model, maybe to also now embrace, these new technologies that might help to remedy the climate change? And
look,
Kairam,
the CCS and CCU will not solve the climate crisis. This is at least from what we see today, what we can see today, because it's very expensive. It is part of the solution, don't get me wrong, but it's very expensive. So if we cannot agree on a price of carbon of like a couple $100, how are we going to pay for $1,000 for a CCS per ton of carbon? So of course we can expect also some prices to drop there over time, but we are working against a very tight timeline, so to say. And this timeline is defined by how much CO2 we have already put into the atmosphere, because it doesn't just magically disappear, it stays there, and how much we are putting in every day. And we, meaning the global community, not only Germany or the US. So I think it's good to invest into research and such there, but the focus should always be to use the existing toolkit that we have, which includes solar, wind, which includes natural regeneration of lands, because we know that these things work. And it's, of course, always more efficient if you can go to the source of the problem and eliminate that than to, try to capture carbon that you have already released, for example, into the atmosphere. So I think this is really key. And I think this was also the great advantage that Germany had built early on in society, to build a consensus around also the exit from fossil fuels. So not only subsidizing and giving handouts to ramp up renewables. Yes, that's maybe also part, maybe also we now be more done on this following this infrastructure money that is coming through. But also building a consensus to phase out coal, at least, and to phase out the combustion engine. These are hard fights that have been fought for many years. And I think it needs this complementary strategy, because otherwise we're just adding to the system, right? So if we just add on top of the energy that is being produced from coal, oil and gas, then we're not really solving the issue, because it's cumulative emissions that are hurting us. And So I do think there is this especially through the CDU-CSU, this general drive to also explore new technologies, but they also, in my view, understand that the rollout of renewable energy and also the phase out in whatever form is necessary to combat this crisis. But that we also have parts of our industry, and Germany wants to remain an industrial place of industry and of exports of the car industry, etc. So they also know that some of these, especially heavy and chemical industries, are very hard to abate. Yeah. So in these areas where we don't have the solution of electrifying of renewable energies, there we have more ability to really maybe explore new technologies and maybe replace ones that exist and don't really serve sustainability goals yet.
I want to stick with this theme a little bit longer, because I think this is really interesting. And Kira, I think you said something really important just now about Germany working very hard to try to build consensus within Europe for an exit away from fossil fuels. When I think back 5, 6, 7 years, here at the ACG, we were doing lots of programming on the Energiewende as sort of a model for all of us. And I felt a little bit like that sort of stalled out until the war in Ukraine happened, and that was a revitalization in terms of thinking about renewables. But it also led to greater use of fossil fuels, going back to brown coal in parts of Germany, and really a step back. And so it's, on the one hand, almost ironic that it took the conflict in Ukraine to increase awareness about the importance of moving forward with renewables, but at the same time has had this negative impact in terms of more fossil fuels being used. As the two of you sort of look ahead, what are your thoughts on what the incoming Christian Democrat, Social Democrat might do, where some of the priorities might be? And you've talked a little bit about that, but also how we really move forward quickly when it comes to the energy transition.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. I mean, I would first of all love to jump in on this point about the consensus in Germany, because I do think for American listeners, it's important to emphasize this point, that is achievement of its own, to have parties across the spectrum endorse and adopt the climate policy, climate targets in the Paris Climate Agreement. That is a remarkable fact, and it is different than the situation in the United States. I do think that consensus begins to break down when it comes to questions of sacrifice, when it comes to questions of, well, who should be paying for the transition, how fast should it be happening, who may be having to give up something that they are used to already receiving. That's where you see in German politics this abstract consensus begin to break down in practice. to some extent, the last government collapsed in part because of disagreements of this kind. There were, we don't need to get into all of the details, but the nitty-gritty of home heating legislation really essentially accelerated the collapse of the government. And when I said that this kind of Biden approach is maybe adopted by Germany, and I sort of meant precisely the kind of doubling down on the use of carrots as it was often referred to in the Biden era, incentives in the form of money rather than disincentives in the forms of regulation. And I do think that with this new debt policy in Germany and the commitment to spend more, it is this kind of emphasis on carrots and de-emphasis on sticks, and making that the heart of a new policy. I mean, I think there was the hope otherwise. Someone like Robert Habeck, I think, who was the climate minister of the last government, hoped he could kind of persuade people to sacrifice, but in practice that often came apart. So and so going forward, I do think it is this money that's being set aside for the climate transition that I think is going to be something that the government in Germany is really focused on distributing and trying to use to accelerate the transition in Germany. I mean, that seems to be who will have access to it, I think, is an important question, and where will it be located? Until now in Germany, there's been this past government had a combined economic and climate ministry. My understanding is the climate policy is now supposed to be recentered to the environmental ministry. And then the question of who has access to this new pot of money, who can distribute it, and to what purpose, is that going to be under the control of the economics ministry, the industry, essentially the Ministry of Industry, or is it going to be the Ministry of the Environment? And so I do think that's an important question that we'll probably have an answer to soon as they wrap up their coalition negotiations.
Particularly at a time when there's a big debate going on within Europe, but even just within Germany about competitiveness and how Germany remains competitive, and as Kira touched on earlier, the future of the German automotive industry. But Kira, do you have anything to add to what Cameron just said?
Yeah, I mean, my hope is not that it's just going to be like a series of handouts to foster societal cohesion. I mean, I think Germany needs to use especially the climate money wisely to induce a transition that is beneficial for the economy and the people. And I think this economic argument is something that's very strong in the Christian Democrats party, and they have made this also in the parts that are still visible in these leaked documents very clear that they want this to serve also the economy, the effort of climate protection to go hand in hand to serve the economy. And yeah, of course, there are disagreements on how, but I see that part of a healthy democratic process, and also a competition for the best policies and the best solutions to be put into practice. So I would have liked to see also more ambition coming from what is now being negotiated in the coalition. But I'm quite optimistic that this coalition will stay course, which is already a lot given the polarizing environments we're seeing worldwide, given the pressure that is on Germany from populist forces and the interventionism of, for example, J.D. Vance trying to push the AfD in Germany through his speech in the Munich Security Conference. The AfD is a climate denial party, a right-wing extremist party, first to say that, but also including very strong climate change denialism. And the US is putting pressure thereby through its government on Germany to give this party more room. And this also includes a pushback on potential climate policies, of course. So, so it is a difficult environment, and I'm quite relieved to see, and I really look forward to what is coming in the next years here in Germany, because I think Germany can use this moment to position itself as a leader in some of these technologies. If the US decides to really part ways with this this part of the global agenda, the common fight for climate protection.
So there's been a sort of active exchange in the Q&A, and Kira, you picked up on one of the questions that somebody just asked about the stance of the AfD when it comes to the climate, or it comes to the energy transition and its views on climate. So thank you for answering that question. But I have a couple of other questions I'd like to fold in. One of our viewers picked up on this notion that both of you mentioned of the green transition being unstoppable, and wrote that even in Texas, this is the case. Texas is now thought of as the wind power capital here in the United States. But that viewer goes on to ask whether you think that Germany will increase its imports of LNG from the US in the mid to long term because of its energy needs. And of course, a couple of people have asked the thorny question of what your thoughts are on nuclear power for Germany. This is sort of the current situation has reopened the debate as to whether nuclear power is in the mix or not. So one specific question about LNG from the US, and the other question about what's the future of nuclear power in Germany?
I'm happy to try to address both of those. I mean, I think the example of LNG in the German context is instructive in the period of energy crisis after the start of the Ukraine war. This was at a point when the Green Party was in power in Germany, and you had the, as I mentioned, the combined Ministry of Industry and Climate Ministry led by a Green minister. And although he, entered office with very big ambitions of accelerating climate policy, faced with a moment of crisis, he was the one who led the effort to find new sources of fossil fuels at a moment of precarity and energy scarcity. And he was at pains to do so, but he at a moment of crisis, the country clearly prioritized energy security over climate policy, and he sort of he kind of represented that. And I think going forward, there's a new element of geopolitics now involved here as well, in that you have a Trump administration that clearly treats foreign policy in very transactional terms, and it would not be none of us should be shocked if kind of basic security commitments are linked to economic transactions of the sort like buying LNG from the United States. I mean, this was during the first Trump administration already a point of emphasis. I mean, it's easy to forget this, but it was the Trump administration that was intent on sanctioning the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that brought in Russian gas to Germany. They wanted to insist on buying American gas. So this element of geopolitics and national security being an element of energy policy is I think now certainly a new something that needs to be considered. I forgot your second question, Steve. That was
yeah. So it had to do with nuclear power and the debate over nuclear power in Germany. Whether that's, I mean, it's something that we have in our programming over the last 3 or 4 years repeatedly gotten the question from people. Everybody I have talked to up until the last 2 months has said no, absolutely not. And all of a sudden, it seems as if a couple of people might be more open to it in Germany, even if that does not reflect the mood in society?
I'm also happy to let Kira answer, but I would also say I always get this question, and I think people outside of Germany are fascinated by it. It is the answer I ultimately always find myself giving is that it is a peculiarity of the German political context that one simply needs to understand the historic background of. There is a long social movement that ultimately resulted in the end of the use of nuclear power, and it's the politics of it are simply strike me as too complicated to really consider reversing in any way. I mean, setting and that contributes to the economics, the complications of. I mean, like, in other words, we can't separate those two things. And I think anyone who tries to cite like the basic economics or the basic other, the climate aspects of it are sort of missing the politics of it and how that bleeds into all of the other aspects of the policy. But anyway, I'll
Kira, any thoughts on LNG or nuclear? Otherwise, I have another question for you, which has also come up recently and has been a bit of a political debate within the Christian Democrats, and that is whether or not Nord Stream 2 will be turned on, right? If there were to be a lasting peace in Ukraine. This seems to be one of the big debates that's coming up in the German political scene again now.
Yeah, thanks for raising those questions. I also don't foresee a nuclear renaissance in Germany's energy sector, just to second that. On Nord Stream, so I hope this will not happen, and I'm strongly against the revival of the Nord Stream pipeline gas. And I think there's a number of reasons against it. The first one is geostrategic. What if we now reconnect the structure, again, go into this dependency, and then even if there is a sort of temporary peace, Russia attacks again, Ukraine or another country. Then what do? We start the whole show again. We start this whole painful transition or crisis again that we were in? I don't think so. The second one is economic. There was this painful moment of transitioning more to LNG sources, to replace some of the pipeline gas with LNG sources, and to also reduce the dependency on gas a little bit. And this is a path we have taken with a lot of costs to society, especially to poorer households, people who can't just switch because they have a gas stove, they have a gas heating system. You can't switch that to also nuclear energy, what some people have argued. It's not possible if you have to have gas in your pipe. So you have this dependency, and this substitution happened, and there's economic path dependency also on building a bunch of LNG terminals and making investments there. So I also don't think there's an economic interest in this. And the third one, I mean, that's sort of obvious from my professional title, is that it's completely against our climate targets, right? So from the climate targets, we need to go down with the gas infrastructure that we have, reduce the use of natural gas, and therefore also please no Nord Stream revival. I think it's a completely crazy idea, really.
Yeah.
Thanks. So let me pick up on one thing that you said, Kira, and that is investment. So we just thought, part of a comprehensive effort to tackle this energy transition and climate crisis, of course, the finance sector and what role, does the finance sector play, and what are they doing right now? So it seems like, this Global Alliance for Banks, they just recently called on members to abandon their pledge of aligning their, $54 trillion in assets with the aim to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I hear you, Cameron. You already said, this was long in the making, kind of, that maybe this goal was not sustainable and not achievable. But what do you think of like the banking sector, like seeming to backtrack from their pledge to help sort of push the original Paris climate goal? What's how powerful is that? What impact does that have? And it seems like it's part of a wider shakeout of the whole financial sector of what's happening here. American banks leaving that agreement. I don't know, European banks maybe too. So what is your take on the role of the financial sector and what's happening in that sector? Either way, whoever feels like
to jump in first, but obviously I'd love to hear also what Kira thinks. Yeah, it was just a few years ago that there was so much enthusiasm, right, on the private sector leading the way in accelerating the energy transition, and obviously it's easy to forget that it was a very different economic context, right? At a point of low, sometimes negative interest rates, very cheap money, searching for new potentially lucrative investments. That there was the financial sector on its own declaring this interest in backing the energy transition. Mark Carney, the current Prime Minister of Canada, led an effort where I forget how many trillions of dollars he said he had financial institutions committed to back green projects. I think if you looked at the details of what those commitments amounted to in practice, oftentimes there was less substance to those commitments than it was suggested on the surface. I mean, and if you looked at the number of all the banks that said they were committed to only funding or setting aside a certain amount of money to renewables or clean projects. I mean, in practice, they often didn't follow through. And so I think that's the first thing to point out. But what's then changed in the interim is the economic context as well. And all of a sudden, not only does the economics make it harder, make the choices harder for these financial institutions, but the politics have shifted in the United States that have put pressure on financial institutions not to take a side on climate policy. And maybe we should not be surprised in retrospect. I mean, if these financial institutions, I mean, they are in their nature looking for profits, looking to maximize their profits. If they thought for a time that renewables were the best way to maximize profits, then that's what they're going to go into. They may offer some, ideological reasoning, but I think they're ultimately driven by their calculations of profit. And right now, some of those calculations have shifted.
Right. Kira, do you have anything you'd like to add on that?
Well, I think it's just important to mention that, I mean, this is it's a dangerous game, no? I mean, because it risks a lot of their other portfolios, starting with real estate, right? So we are seeing more aggravating climate impacts. Of course, these are very indirect things I'm talking about, but nevertheless, I assume there's very intelligent people working in these banks. One should realize that we are increasing the risks of other assets becoming worthless because of severe climate impacts. We are risking supply chain disruptions because of extreme weather events. And also, of course, there is this the sort of less tangible risk of a sort of carbon bubble that once fossil fuel stocks may actually fall because we have this alternative energies that are really taking off and people turn their backs on fossil fuels. Of course, this right now seems to be a bit further away than at least the climate science community would like. But nevertheless, it's a financial risk that could come into being if we see a devaluation of some of these fossil fuel firms who are valued in terms of their assets that they hold of so much CO2 that if you would burn all these assets that current fossil fuel companies you would have a long-term sea level rise of 60 meters. So it's a very dangerous change that has happened. And of course, it's very sobering to see that happening.
Yeah, just one last question on in the finance business realm. So you just mentioned both of you that business, of course, are profit oriented. But that could mean that they would determine that the future lies in the use of sustainable energy and net zero emissions, which you both also pointed out already. But what do you think, like pinning it down, what are the chances that businesses will pursue a green transition without these regulatory benefits in forms of subsidies, carrots, Cameron, that you mentioned? How strong is this market advantage of competitiveness with, probably future-oriented technologies, or maybe even the green label with consumers? But like for a business person, what is the path, basically?
Maybe I can start on this one. I mean, I think in Germany and Europe, you have the emissions trading system and the CO2 pricing, also additional CO2 pricing in Germany. And also in this new government, they stand by this CO2 pricing, which I think is a very effective and efficient instrument in order to incentivize businesses and create a somewhat equal playing field, at least together perhaps with a carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, to transition away from harmful ways of producing, etc. So I think this is really one area where market mechanisms can work. But we also see how difficult it is to increase the prices of CO2, to also cut subsidies of fossil fuels, because it's a heavily subsidized sector where we see a CO2 price of zero would be an advantage in many areas because we have such high subsidies that are basically a negative CO2 price. So I think this is one way, and other forms of regulation, like the supply chain law in Germany, that is also being right now discussed, especially criticized by the Christian Democrat Union. I think it's a very important tool to increase accountabilities of firms over their supply chains. And I think it shows that in the past, given the point that we're at right now, where we had floods in Germany and Lower Saxony and the Ahr Valley in Bavaria, that maybe this is a result of a market failure, right? So we have not been able to resolve this without additional mechanisms in the market. So we are seeing these effects of climate change that we have, the climate science community has predicted 30 years ago. And now we have to avoid that happening in the next 30 years and take a different course. And I think appealing to companies, appealing to their sort of moral sense to solve this crisis is not enough, because you just said they have to make the calculations and they need to compete with their competitors, and they need to invest money. Yeah, so it's in the end an economic case. And of course, I see in Germany and beyond a big business alliance who wants to do more, but who also seek to have better regulatory frameworks or a CO2 price that makes it easier for them. So both sides are needed.
We've talked a lot about the private sector and also the role of government. We haven't, really dug into the role that civil society plays. And so, Cameron, just a super quick question before we sort of zoom out a little bit. You obviously, in some of your research for your book, looked at groups like Letzte Generation, but there are others, of course, like Fridays for Future. What role do you think these kinds of activist groups have in sort of shaping the dialogue and maybe even cajoling both business but also government into some of their policy positions? Do you think that there's the potential for that beyond, of course, just some of the resistance measures that they've taken of gluing themselves to airport runways and things like that?
Yeah, I think German civil society has played a fascinating role in German climate politics, but also a complicated one and an ambivalent one, and I think one that kind of sheds important light on climate politics in general. I mean, it is a civil society group, Fridays for Future, that is often credited with like putting climate policy on the national agenda in a major way in the late part of Angela Merkel's term as chancellor. They managed to bring hundreds of thousands of people to the streets to demand more ambitious climate policy, and cross sections across of society demonstrating this kind of political desire for more climate policy. And yet it also kind of ran against its limits. The Merkel government responded with a Klimapaket, at the time that was nowhere near what the group itself was demanding, and they were citing the science behind the need for reform. But I think that also highlights how the scientific arguments are ultimately not politically sufficient. This is, I think, something that politics needs to reckon with. I mean, it's been extremely effective in persuading people to take climate policy seriously, but it's not enough to make political decisions on the basis of citing scientific consensus of various kinds. Political arguments need to be made on their own. And in the disappointment that results from this has led to other groups, including the one that you mentioned, Steve, Letzte Generation, that do pursue more radical methods of trying to coerce political change. And that's kind of led to kinds of backlash. If anything, this has kind of had this paradoxical effect of actually producing public anger and politicians wanting to instrumentalize that anger against climate policy. And I think that was very evident in recent years, and is probably that residue is still evident in Germany. But I think it's incumbent on politics to kind of find other language of describing this problem and of building consensus.
I mean, obviously, climate change is a global problem, not a regional or a national issue. It's one where we all have to pull together. And so in the last few minutes that we have together, I'd like to talk a little bit about the multilateral dimension. We started this conversation by recognizing that the Petersberger climate dialogue just wrapped up in Berlin. And obviously that meeting was important to prepare for COP30, which will take place in Brazil in November of this year. Kira, you were in Baku for COP29. And obviously the situation was a little bit different then. Since then, we've seen the US pull out of a number of agreements, including, once again, pulling back from the Paris Climate Agreement, but also withdrawing from other global climate financing programs where richer, more affluent countries have tried to help poorer countries stop using coal and other fossil fuels. As we start to finish our conversation, but also look to the future, what's the right multilateral framework to move climate policy forward? Kira, I'd love to get your thoughts on that first, and then bring Cameron in.
Yeah, so I mean, the US has left the climate agreement, and it's like we're getting practice in this, right? Like Kyoto, Paris in the first Trump administration. Now again, the US is not a strong partner on climate. The community, of course, always welcomes the US back in once there is the consensus to do so. but it has shown again and again that it's not a strong partner, also on the finance side. The amount of money that the US has put in the pot for international climate finance is by no means paying any sort of fair share when comparing to their economic size, the size of their market. I mean, just the loss of even under the leadership of the last years, where the US was very vocal, great speeches, but then they put 17 million euro into the loss and damage fund. I mean, I'm surprised it's not a source for national embarrassment, honestly. This is like one project that Germany does of the International Climate Initiative, It's a very small amount of money. It seems like a lot, but it's not. So in the global scale, this money is distributed over many countries, etc. So yeah, the US has left the COP. This is damaging for the COP. This is probably more damaging than the first time. But also, I think a lot of countries are now looking to China, how China will perform at the next COP. China can now position itself, thanks to this, as a source of stability. So especially in the international climate sphere, this will appeal to a lot of global South countries, and also, of course, to other countries who want to do more on climate. So I think still the COP, to answer your question, actually, the COP is still a very important place to engage on this issue, because it is a global challenge. We cannot do it. We also know that many fossil fuel resources lie in authoritarian countries, like, for example, Russia, but also Saudi Arabia, etc. So we need this multilateral approach to it, but it's not enough. It's necessary but not sufficient, the policy nerd would say, right? So you need more. So we need other bilateral agreements. We need multilateral partnerships like the JET piece, etc. And we need the societies to stand behind this. And I think the Priorities for Future, I just want to come very briefly back to this point. It is an inspiring story in the end. Yeah, they didn't achieve everything that they wanted to achieve. But like some schoolgirls, they brought down, they accomplished so much, like, Greta and Luisa Neubauer. I mean, these are schoolgirls at that time. They brought a government to their knees to change course, Of course, there was also a long-standing movement and such that they could build on, and scientists who supported and such, but it's a really important and inspiring story. And I also want to stress that up until today, we are we are facing some protests which are much smaller in scale, but I'm very proud to live in a country that is free and where people who are of foreign descent, who are not German nationals, can participate in foreign protests and not be detained and reverse their visa and deported from this country. So it's great to live in a free country like Germany.
Cameron, anything to add on this multilateral dimension?
Well, yeah, I would love to. I endorse Kira's description there at the end of the virtues of living in a place like Germany at a moment like this. And I also would say that I agree that it's important generally to maintain a hopeful posture on all of these issues. I mean, and I think that appeal, I think that Kira made is an important one, and it's one that often has come up in events where I'm discussing this issue. The fact that we're not making sufficient progress, or that we're hitting these obstacles, or that we've failed to meet targets, does not mean that we're not making progress and that we're not moving in the right direction. And so I think that's an important point as well. On the multilateralism, I also would agree generally with the assessment. I mean, I do think that as countries, we should be looking to, though perhaps to other countries for leadership, and China as a country that has made serious commitments of its own, clearly has ambitions, and is clearly also affected by the future of climate change as well, in ways that should give it a bigger leadership role in these international forums. But what I would add to that is, I think generally, I think in these multilateral forums and in politics in general, we should be talking more about adaptation And our failures to meet our targets is something that needs to become a political issue, because I do think the shifting to the needs of adaptation, the needs of countries around the world for assistance in adapting to climate change, and countries in the West needing to shift to talking about those needs as well is an important overall point. And I just think adaptation needs to be a bigger role in politics internationally and nationally.
Adaptation is certainly mitigating climate change, right? That's making sure nobody's left behind, and no new inequalities. I mean, we're facing it right now, but we have to remedy that situation. So that's another topic, probably for another talk. But I would like to, Cameron, since you picked up on the notion of leadership, I would just like to close this discussion. We have 1 minute left with a viewer question, and the viewer asked, so in Europe and globally, who is leading the process of the green transition? And Cameron, you also brought in China, so this is interesting. Now we're even talking about China, playing a significant role. Used to be one of the biggest emitters, but now maybe a leader in developing green technologies. So it's the question is there a leader on the global stage for green transition, or is it really a mutual combined effort with no clear leadership from one single country or region?
I'm not sure there's a political leader. I think that gets into questions of international relations that are always very fraught. It's hard to designate a leader in any kind of international process. But I think technologically, as you just said, China is at the forefront, and I think we're at a moment where technology is going to be playing also a bigger role in our political debates about this, and we're going to need continued technological development and deployment. And so I think that de facto puts China in a leadership role generally.
Kira, do you agree with that, or you want to add one last sentence?
Yeah, I mean, internationally speaking, you asked about where, but I want to answer internationally speaking. Of course, we're all looking now towards Brazil, right? So they have an excellent diplomatic service, which is a great precondition to negotiate a climate agreement. And it's of course a tall order given the political circumstances that we just discussed. But of course, I look towards Marina da Silva and Lula to really lead the world towards a better outcome. And then, China has a made in China strategy that it very skillfully executed through massive subsidies, among other things, where it identified a number of key technologies, including on energy efficiency, etc. And including a lot of green tech thereby, where it's controlling most of the supply chains or key components of these supply chains, such as mineral refinement. And this is, of course, for the climate an opportunity, but in the sense of systemic rivalry between democracies and other forms, it is also a real challenge. And it's a challenge for countries like Germany that have manufacturing sectors that it wants to retain. So yeah, that's my broad answer. Yes, definitely a leader, but also a leader in emissions, as we know, China. So we will see if the Chinese government also lives up to the challenge to go down on the emissions and not only add renewables at a breathtaking scale to its system.
Well, thank you so much. So we're 3 minutes over time, which then I think we could go on. There's so much to talk about it, but thank you both so much for joining us today for this really important talk, I think, on where we're heading and with the green transition. And what I take away is, the green transition is not dead. It's unstoppable. It will continue despite its setbacks, and we'll just see how it will unfold in the next months and years to come. So thank you so much for your time, for joining us. Thank you to our audience for joining us from Europe, from the United States. And we will have 2 more episodes already lined up in our series, Hot Topics Cold Realities, one on April 10th on the rule of law and one on May 27th on sovereign debt. So if you're interested in any of those topics, please make sure to join us again. And with that, thank you again. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to the audience for joining us, and have a great day. Thanks.